Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. A good topic? Let's do it. What's the most paranormal thing that has ever happened to you? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. When I was in a forest alone, I heard someone calling my name out of nowhere, and no one was there aside from me. I heard it like the voice of my cousin, and then I immediately ran out of the forest. Driving through a reservation late at night, I saw what looked like someone riding on horseback along the side of the road. Not uncommon, but in full ceremonial tribal dress. They briefly went out of sight as they crested a hill, and then when I crested, they were gone. I asked some of the folks I worked with on the reservation about it, asking whether there was a powwow or something similar happening. There wasn't, but they did say that the road used to be a horse path used by hunters and warriors before colonization. Probably just a dude on a horse, and my brain misinterpreted what I was seeing, but who knows. It definitely made the hair in the back of my neck stand up though. I'm a huge skeptic, so this is the only case where I've ever seen or heard something that couldn't be easily explained. I was staying in a creepy cabin with my family when I was a young teenager. In the middle of the night, I was sitting in bed, my back against a wall. Right behind me, I heard a woman say, "I'm behind you. The wall leads outside. There's no room behind me." My ex-wife and I, around the year 2006, were watching TV one evening and suddenly we heard a sound coming from the bathroom. I walked in, and both hot and cold water in the bathtub were turned all the way on. No one else was at home. Neither of us had gotten up in hours. From 1992 until mid-1998, my family hung out with another family a lot. They had a son I played baseball with and went to school with, and they had an older daughter who would watch us, my little sister, my friend, and me, while our parents went out for dinner. A week before Christmas '98, the daughter had come home from her freshman year of college and was going to meet a friend at the mall when she was tragically killed by a drunk driver. It naturally devastated my friend's family, and our family stopped hanging out much. However, my dad and his dad would meet for breakfast once a month, and his dad said there had been some strange things going on since she died. Their dogs would stare into her room and wag their tails, and one would lay in her bed exactly as he did when he would lay with her. They would also smell her perfume, and they thought my friend was spraying it, but they hid the bottle and still smelled it. My dad told us this, and I was skeptical until I went to his house one day to hang out. We were walking upstairs to his room, and as we turned to go down the hallway, his dog was standing at her door, looking up, tail wagging, mouth open with his tongue out, and then began backing up like a dog would when someone was walking at it with its eyes fixed on something. I assumed his mom and dad were in there, but nobody was in her room. My friend just shrugged and said, "Hey," his sister's name, "I miss you." I would have never believed it if I hadn't seen it. The building I used to work in was haunted. Lots of weird stuff, shadows, noises, motion, sensitive things would go off when no one was around. Things falling off shelves for no reason, all the usual. The ladies' room in the basement would regularly have noises coming from it that sounded like several girls whispering and giggling. If you stood outside the door, you would feel like you could almost make out what they were saying, but couldn't quite understand it. The noise would stop if you went into the bathroom and wouldn't happen again until another night. There was also a creepy, emaciated old man that would stand behind my car, blocking me from backing up. He was only visible in the rear view mirror. If I turned around to look at him, he wouldn't be there. It didn't matter where in the lot I parked, he would still show up. It got so bad that I stopped looking in my mirror before backing up. But the worst one was a night that a coworker and I were the last two to leave and were locking up. I went to leave a note on the receptionist's desk for her in the morning, and while I was writing it, I noticed on her phone system screen that a phone in the basement call center was just picked up. It then showed it dialed another extension in the call center, and that extension started blinking, showing it was ringing. The second extension was then picked up. At that point, I wondered if someone was still in the call center, so I used the call monitor to listen in on the call. What we heard was a weird, raspy noise that sounded like a mix of heavy breathing and a really slow burp. It went on for several seconds, then stopped. Then the phone system showed that one extension hung up and then the other. I hung up the receptionist's phone, and my coworker and I decided whatever the hell was downstairs was welcome to play with the phones all it wanted, because there was no way we were going down there to investigate. We locked up and left. I did not look in my mirror before backing out of my parking spot. I have a little sister who's 5 years younger than me. When I was around 10 and she was 5, she had an imaginary friend. I didn't think much of it because that's what kids do, I guess. That was until she informed us he was a little boy but older than her, and she always sees him swinging from his neck from the tree branch in our backyard. My mom asked her, "Why is he on the tree?" To which she responded, "He wanted to see his dad." Out of morbid curiosity, my dad looked up to see if anyone had died in our house. An 11-year-old boy hung himself a few weeks after his dad passed away in a car wreck. I was alone in the house when I saw a man walking a dog out the window. Dad texted me to check the post. I opened the door to see the shadow of a man and dog coming toward me, so I shut the door and ran to the kitchen. I stood staring at the door and somebody was standing there. It was an all-black figure. You can usually see clothes through the frosted glass, but this was all black. I wasn't going to open it as I wasn't expecting anybody. I turned my head for a second and the silhouette had gone. I walked to the living room and saw the man and dog were gone. I don't know what it was, but it was very creepy. Years ago, I lived in this complex for youth risks. There was a giant shared yard or patio in the middle, one building on the right, another one on the left, and another in the middle that was abandoned and locked off. Anyway, in the 80s, the middle one had 4 girls apparently get into some altercation, resulting in them all dying. I don't know the details. People said you could hear them arguing at times loudly. For a year, I never heard a sound. One day, I'm outside having a cigarette with about 7 other guys, and we hear screaming coming from there, like blood-curdling screams, and girls screaming in a mix of Spanish and English. Lights were turning on, and you could see things slamming. One guy managed to convince 2 to go check with him in case some people snuck in and were in danger. As they were going in, you could still hear it, even when they were inside. One of them said when they walked in that it sounded like it was all around them, and another said when he was clearing the rooms on the left side that the corner of his eye saw 2 young women screaming at each other, and when he went to face them, they were gone. Before they went in, we called the police. When one and his partner rolled up, the screams and shit were still happening, so he called backup as he ran inside. All 5 came out after it stopped, just in shock. Other cops showed up, and they were checking it multiple times. Nothing was ever found. We spoke about it very rarely after that. Seeing the little blue lights in the forest that looked like fireflies. I wasn't the only one who saw them. I was like 12 when I saw them at a summer camp when we were playing a camp game with everyone in the middle of the night. The instructors were playing on different instruments, and we were supposed to find them by sound and collect papers with numbers. We were struggling to find the last one. There were already fireflies everywhere, and suddenly there were blue ones. They brought us to the last instructor. Not me exactly. When my grandmother, Nanny, was dying of cancer, toward the end she first complained that someone was pacing the hallway outside her bedroom at night, keeping her awake. Heavy footsteps. Nobody else could hear it. Then a couple of weeks before she passed, she told my dad that a friend of her great-grandfather's, Billy Mitchell, had stopped by, and they had a nice long talk. My dad reminded her that Billy Mitchell had been dead for 30 years. Nanny said she knew that, but also knew she'd spent 2 hours talking to him the night before. The pacing with the heavy footsteps stopped after that. When the pacing sound started, our boxer, Heidi, started laying in the hallway at night. Before she usually went room to room at night, before ending up in my dad's room. After the visit from Billy, she started sleeping in Nanny's room at night, which she hadn't really done before. After Nanny passed, Heidi went back to what she did before. The third man syndrome. I believe this phenomenon happened to me on a cold, wintry night in New York City. Having just left the Comedy Cellar and being on vacation, I decided to explore a bit of New York City and got lost. Well, I knew where I was, I just didn't know where a subway entrance was. It was like 2 a.m. at this point. There were still some people walking around, but I started to freak out since it was freezing and I was nowhere near my hotel. Then suddenly I heard a male voice directly behind me, like whispering it to me, telling me to go 2 streets up north and turn right for the train station. I turned around to thank him and no one was there. I flipped out and ran. Ironically, I followed the voice's directions, saw the subway entrance, and was back at the hotel before 3. I like to believe it's because of how cold it was, and because my mind was in do or die mode, and somehow, subconsciously, remembered where the subway was, and the voice was telling me. 2 years ago, we had my great-grandpa living in the house with us. I've had a feeling he was going to meet his end soon, so I said I love you to him every night before bed. We moved into a new house, and every time I had my door open, I would see a weird, shadowy figure of a person looking in at me. I only saw it out of the corner of my vision, but I could feel it staring at me. It had no features. A few months after I started seeing it, we went on a family road trip with my great-grandpa. We were at a hotel one night, and we started hearing someone shaking the door handle and throwing tiny rocks at the window. I got on the floor under the window as my grandma grabbed her gun in case it was some crackhead or something. I don't know why, but I lifted the curtain a little and saw that there was no one there. Even through the doorknob was still rattling. After the road trip, I was at my cousin's house when I was informed that my great-grandpa had fallen ill and was in the hospital. A few days later, he passed away. At the funeral, I told my grandma about the shadow figure in my doorway. She told me that she too had seen a shadow figure, but it was standing in her hallway watching her. I stopped seeing the shadow after my great-grandpa passed. Many things. Plate falling out of a cupboard for no reason at all while I was home alone. The cupboard door never opened or closed. The house would yell, howl my name from its guts. Don't ask me to explain because I can't. It came from the house, but not inside the house, just the house itself. It would turn the motion lights on inside the house when we knew there was no valid reason for them to come on. Last but not least, a friend of a family member stopped by with said family member. After making his way through the living room, a friend said jokingly, "So where's your ghost?" The lights dimmed down and back up before I could even get a word out. The 3 of us were standing right in front of the dimmer dial, and none of us touched it. When I was about 12 years old, my brother and I visited our grandfather's gravestone for the first time. He had died young and we'd never met him. Our aunt, his daughter, who lived nearby the cemetery, would visit occasionally, and she told us she had experienced strange coincidences several times surrounding her visits. On the drive there, she told us he would have been happy that we were coming. It was a completely overcast day, 100% gray and drizzly. As we approached his site, about a row away, my aunt said, "Now watch this." We stepped up to a stone, and suddenly the sky above us parted very quickly until there was a clear blue patch right above us. The sun came through, and rays shone down right on top of us. All 3 of us were speechless, and still remember the moment now almost 30 years ago. I like to think he was telling us he was happy to see us. I was quite heavily pregnant when it became clear my father-in-law wasn't going to survive his leukemia. We made an appointment to find out the sex of the baby to tell him just in case, but he took a turn for the worse before we could go. My husband and his family were there when his dad passed, and it was peaceful. I was making my way to the house where he'd passed shortly afterwards and heard, clear as anything, "It's a boy, and I know it's a boy." We never did go to the appointment. There was no need. My son was born about 6 weeks later, and he carries a middle name to reflect the grandfather he just missed meeting. It could be a coincidence, but it's been nearly 18 years, and thinking about that moment still chokes me up. He knew. Stories about the elderly and recently departed and pregnancy, it's intriguing because I've seen some things that are definitely interesting when it comes to that type of stuff, so thanks for sharing. I work in a hotel down a corridor on my own during the day. I was the head housekeeper and would occasionally deep clean rooms if I had the time and the hotel was quiet. It was a narrow corridor with 10 rooms, 5 on either side, and quite possibly the most renowned for paranormal activity. I could hear the continuous banging of a window and the wind in one of the rooms, so I knocked on each and called, "Hello, housekeeping," even though I knew each room was empty. I found the window and closed it fully, but as I walked back to the top of the corridor and into the first bedroom that I was working in, a loud, gravelly, rough male voice shouted, "Hello," loudly right in my ear. The hair stood up on my arms and neck, and I ran to my office, panting in fear. About a month before, one of my staff had seen an old lady holding onto the dado rail in the corridor as if exhausted and struggling to breathe. She put her work things down and went to open the fire door in between them to ask the guest if she was okay, but she disappeared into thin air in front of her eyes. She too ran to my office in shock and said that when she first saw her, she didn't realize it at the time, but the lady was actually in black and white. So was the corridor behind her, like she was watching an old film through the glass. This is in the UK. I have 2. 1. My grandfather had died about a month prior to this happening. He had throat cancer, and I don't remember exactly what happened, but he ended up suffocating to death somehow. I had an uncle who had a mental breakdown and ended up shooting my aunt in the back of the head, my other uncle in the leg, and then killing himself. A family member called my mom and me so we could go to my dad's house and be there when the news broke, since we knew he was going to have a very intense reaction. As my uncle called my dad to tell him, my dad was on the porch and my sister and I were in the living room. I'm 13 years older than her, so I was just there to make sure she didn't get too freaked out. I was 16 and she was 3 at the time. So as my dad was finding out about this, my sister looked up at the ceiling and said, "I see my grandpa and he's blue," which weirded me out because he obviously would have turned some sort of blue while suffocating. Then I took her up to her room when my dad came in so she didn't have to see his outburst, which completely destroyed the whole first story of his apartment. And we went to play in a little princess tent she had. Then she started screeching about the monsters trying to get her. I ended up pretending a little princess wand she had was a sword for the monsters, and it calmed her down. But if she could see Grandpa, I wondered what monsters were. 2. My mom and I had moved to a new house to get away from my dad. There were black and white pictures of trees and stuff on the wall in the dining room and kitchen. They went well with the decor, so we just left them there when we moved. About 3 years after we moved in, all in one night, they fell off the wall one by one. I was sleeping in the living room that night and was obviously very freaked out. It wasn't storming or anything. It was a completely calm night, so it wasn't from the house shaking. Eventually, I was able to fall back asleep and was woken up to someone throwing a brick at our window. It was a very nice neighborhood, and that was the only time anything weird ever happened, but it definitely freaked me out. My mom, sister, and I are all sensitive to spirit. I've only seen a spirit once, while other experiences were mostly through having an internal sense that something else was present. Sometimes unexplained things would happen to my physical surroundings when I had that gut feeling. When I moved to my current house, I first lived in the basement apartment for a few years. Immediately I knew there was a presence. I just knew it wasn't malevolent necessarily, nor good, but definitely aware of me and sometimes watching intensely. I knew it was male and that it stayed almost exclusively in my bathroom. I felt it watching me the most when I showered. I convinced myself that maybe I was just loony and nothing was actually there. Even if it was, I didn't want to interact with it anyway. About a year ago, a friend of a friend came over. I'd never met him before, and had also never mentioned the spirit to the friend who had invited him. We all hung out. He used the restroom, and then we headed outside to smoke. Once we left the property, he told us that he saw something in the bathroom. He was standing up facing the toilet when he noticed the face in his peripheral vision by the door. He initially thought it was one of us being super weird and peeping. When he turned around, he saw a man's face in the doorway, staring dead at him. He was older and had a creepy, steady gaze. He was there for a second or two when my friend blinked and the face disappeared. I was honestly shaken when I heard this, but also a bit relieved when I realized I was maybe a little less crazy than I'd thought. Thankfully, I've since moved upstairs and haven't had an issue or supernatural experience since. My house is haunted. Both my mom and I saw parts of the same ghost. Things have moved for no reason, and other people who didn't know have felt energy where we saw her. Most of the time, it's just annoying, like my computer mouse flying off my desk. It ramped up for a while, and I started telling her if she had a problem with the garbage, she could put it in the garbage can. Same with the laundry. She was welcome to fold it instead of dropping the same item on the floor 3 times. After that, she quieted down. Very judgmental old lady at times. I'm a New Orleans native. I've lived pretty consistently in Baton Rouge for the last 35 plus years. When Katrina happened, my mother and sisters evacuated to my place, so it was like 6 weeks or so after the storm, the waters were down, and my family had returned to their homes. I decided to drive around Lakeview to, sightsee. I'd lived in that neighborhood as a child, and it was familiar to me. It was also one of the hardest hit neighborhoods in New Orleans. I drove around for a bit, then had to pull over to cry for a bit. When I got home later, my then husband asked how it was, and I said completely unconsciously there were ghosts everywhere. My ex said later, "You looked really surprised and scared after you said that." I still don't know why I said that, it just came out. I didn't even consciously think that, let alone form the thought to say it. I'd felt watched once or twice. Of course, this was after I got a phone call 2 days after the storm from my brother, who was doing a tour in Iraq and was frantic to know where the family was, because he didn't know if they'd evacuated. I spoke to him, then handed the phone to my mom, who talked to him for about 5 minutes. The phone line had been out before the call, so I assumed my phone service had been restored. I went to use the phone later and the line was out. It stayed out for 6 weeks. Apparently the line was only functional in order to let my brother contact us. That one still creeps me out a little.